All aboard, all aboard. Heists are cool. I love them, you love them, we all love them. Well, people with assets worth stealing don't, but all of you poors sure love to live out your class revenge fantasies vicariously through a motley band of highly skilled and sticky-fingered scamps, don't you? But do you know what's even better than Ocean's 11? Try 15. And since I really know what the audience likes, I'm going to make this one extra autistic just for you by adding a train to the mix. So, tickets please and full steam ahead as we discuss the most audacious crime of the 20th century. The Great Train Robbery. Please leave a like and a comment on this video because it really helps me in the algorithm. But before we get started, my favourite mad lad of them all is the humble fish. As a hobbyist fisherman, I have a vested interest in making sure that our waters are kept clean and tidy so that the fish are kept healthy. After all, the only thing that they should fear is me, not plastic. But fortunately, we can all help, because a special someone has a birthday coming up, and they want to spend it by giving a gift. So let's all wish your boy a happy 6th birthday. That's right, Raid Shadow Legends is 6 years old, all grown up and better than ever. It feels like only yesterday when I first started crushing scrubs in the PvP arena, and it never gets old. Is there anything better than watching your opponent's team getting absolutely wiped out with AAA fidelity on your big PC screen? Well, it turns out that there is. Doing all of that while helping to save the planet, because you see, your birthday boy is on a mission. Every player who downloads Raid through my link in the description box down below and plays to level 20 will unlock an impact point that Raid will put towards cleaning 1 pound of ocean plastic. And to spread the birthday cheer even further, Raid will double the points you all accumulate at the end of the month. So, if 50 of you reach level 20, Raid will donate 100 impact points to Ocean Cleanup. And all you have to do is click the link in the description box down below or scan the QR code on the screen, play to level 20, and I'll let you all know the impact that you've made in a month's time. But that's not all. Raid is also celebrating their 6th birthday with gifts for you, the player. Exclusively through my link or QR code, new players will get an anniversary starter pack worth $60, which includes the epic champion Zargala. And if you use the promo code Supreme6, you can get her hubby, the Void Legendary Champion Supreme Gallic. Or, if you can use the code MONKEYKING to get Son Wukong, get Alice for Alice the Wanderer, or get Loki for Loki the Deceiver. But these codes are only available 48 hours after downloading with my custom link or QR code. The App Store won't get you these bad boys. Also, make sure you choose carefully because you can only choose one. And while you're at it, you can also join my clan Dank Brigade, and I'll see you all in the game. See if I seem a little bit run down and I'm not as energetic as I usually am, it's because I've just gotten over 2 weeks of food poisoning, which has also triggered stomach ulcers. So I am in a huge amount of pain. I'm in a huge amount of pain and I am on a lot of codeine. And I'm also not allowed to eat and I'm only getting about 2 hours of sleep every night because of the pain. So if I'm a little bit run down and I'm not as energetic as I usually am, that's why, and I'm very, very sorry about that. But I'm in a lot of pain, but I'm being a big brave boy, and I'm just going to soldier through it. See, this is the problem with being self-employed and you've got staff to pay. If you ever get sick, tough shit. On the 7th of August 1963, a travelling post office train was to make an overnight journey from Glasgow to London Euston, scheduled to leave at 1850 and arrive at 0400, after a few stops along the way to offload some post that was being sorted on board. And there was a lot of post because the cargo had piled up over the bank holiday weekend, and the high-value packet carriages were particularly stacked, full of old currency, mainly £1 and £5 notes, that were southbound for decommissioning, as well as a shipment of diamonds for London's Hatton market. All in, a payload that was usually worth about £300,000 contained well over £2 million. But all of this loot wasn't left unattended. There were 80 staff on board the train, 2 engineers, 5 guards in the HVP carriages, and the rest were spread all across the rest of the train, sorting the post on its way down to London. Not the securest setup in the world, is it? But it's fine. How could one possibly rob a train hurtling down to London? This isn't the Wild West. Well, if you've ever been on a British train, you will know that they are very, very good at not fucking moving. So, there'll be plenty of opportunity. Not helping with the train security was the presence of a mole, a postal worker known only as the Ulsterman, who had access to all of the information that I just gave you. And he leaked it to a criminal lawyer named Brian Arthur Field. And by criminal lawyer, I don't mean that he was a barrister. He was like when Saul Goodman first got introduced in Breaking Bad. He was a literal criminal lawyer. Field knew exactly what to do with this information, and introduced the Ulsterman to the perfect brains for the operation that he had in mind. Antique dealer Bruce Reynolds and hairdresser Gordon Goody. Both men had connections to a couple of outfits named the South Coast Raiders and the Red Light Gang. Though the second one sounds like they do a different kind of job that involves running trains. But anyway, they came together to form a super gang led by Reynolds, with the 15 men all saying, "You son of a bitch, I'm in." In addition to Goody, Reynolds' motley crew included their treasurer, Charles Wilson, also a former boxer named Ronald Buster Edwards, and most famously, Ronald Ronnie Biggs. Other notable figures in the roster included some South Coast Raiders. Bookie by day, intimidating heavy by night, Tommy Wisby, florist Roger Cordray, nightclub owner Bobby Welch, James Big Jim Hussey, a former para and the gang's quartermaster Jimmy White, and silversmith and racing driver Roy James, who was looking for a big payday to invest in some new motoring tech. The gang members were described in the media by their normal day jobs as florists, antique dealers, and painters and decorators. But make no mistake, every single one of them moonlit as hardened, seasoned criminals, skilled in everything necessary for a career in thievery and thuggery. The right men for the big train job. No small-time roadmen here. If anything, the gang was actually too good at what they did because they'd been pulling off small-scale train jobs for a good long while, which resulted in the high-value carriages getting spruced up a little bit. Bars affixed to their windows, alarms, and extra bolts attached to the doors. Sounds delicious, but by some coincidence, the upgraded carriages were out of service. So, for one night only, the HVP carriages were basically defenceless apart from the 5 guards. The opportunity was too good to pass up. All of the stars aligned perfectly, and after months of meticulous planning, everything was on the right track. Literally. Then, it was showtime. And at about 3 in the morning, on the 8th of August, the train was passing through Buckinghamshire when the drivers spotted an unexpected red signal near Sears Crossing and duly stopped. Upon inspection, they found a glove covering the signal light and a 6-volt battery wired to the red light, which was keeping the red light on. This little trick was a specialty of the South Coast Raiders and was probably carried out by Cordray. Wondering what was going on, the fireman David Whitby got off of the train and picked up the phone by the track to see what was going on, only to discover that the lines had been cut. The robbers had thought of everything. But before he could do anything else, Whitby heard a warning of, "If you shout, I'll kill you." Sources disagree on whether Whitby was then taken back to the train or thrown down the nearby embankment. But considering his fate after the fact, I'm inclined to believe the former. I'd take a tumble down a bank over a hostage situation any day, no matter how cool the train is. Meanwhile, the rest of the gang, masked, gloved, wearing overalls and armed with clubs and iron bars, descended on the train. One of them, most likely Edwards, then whacked the engineer, Jack Mills, over the head with a cosh when he fought back. The two HVP carriages and the engine were then uncoupled, leaving the other postal staff and the 10 carriages that they occupied behind, completely unaware of what was going on. It would be a good while before they figured out that the coupling hadn't broken by accident. But at this point, things went off the rails a little bit. You see, Biggs had literally brought on board an associate, known only as Peter or Stan Agate, to actually drive the train. He had spent months pretending to be a train spotter for the chance to ride in and drive some trains, ready to become the spurgiest getaway driver of all time. But the controls before him were a lot more complicated than he expected. And he couldn't do it. So Biggs had to wake and patch up a bleeding and dazed Mills. And then he forced the poor engineer back into the train to drive a mile down the track, where some vehicles were waiting at Bredego Bridge. Upon arrival at the bridge, some other robbers who were waiting there smashed a window in an HVP carriage, prompting one of the guards to finally notice what was actually going on, and the guard shouted, "It's a raid." They tried to barricade the door with a bunch of bags that were in the carriage, but a robber with a crowbar managed to get in through the window, and he soon had the guards on the ground. One robber was put on babysitting duty while the rest of the robbers formed a human chain down a ramp on the left of the bridge to move the sacks in a chain down the ramp into the getaway vehicles that were waiting underneath the bridge. After just 15 to 20 minutes of solid teamwork, 120 sacks were unloaded into an Austin Lodestar. The gang then shoved Mills, and maybe also Whitby, in an HVP carriage with the guards, and told them to stay put for half an hour before calling the police, giving their main getaway driver, Roy Weasel James, time to get them all out of Dodge. And for good measure, as the gang left with the loot, a couple of empty Land Rovers, both bearing the same license plates, headed off in different directions, serving as decoys. That's pretty clever, actually. The gang then capped off a perfect getaway with their arrival at their hideout in Oakley, Buckinghamshire, Leatherslade Farm, which had been organised by Brian Field. Field bought a farm. Anyway, the haul was secured and Wilson stepped in to count and divide the loot. In total, the gang had stolen £2.6 million, which is worth over £46.5 million today. And this was, at the time, the biggest cash robbery in British history. Each key player in the heist was looking at a share of roughly £150,000 each, with a few small shares reserved and set aside for associates or earmarked for covering expenses. For example, one share of £20,000 was supposed to be for Stan, the would-be train getaway driver, but after he completely fucked it, he got absolutely nothing. He lost. Good day, sir. But hey, we still, to this day, don't even know who he actually even was, so when all is said and done, the real prize was his freedom. The Great Train Robbery, as it came to be known as, was a truly great one. Quick, methodical, and clean. Apart from the coshing of Miles and the little fucky-wucky with the substitute driver, it was the perfect crime. But the robbers' conduct was less than perfect afterwards. To pass the time at the farm, they all played Monopoly with the money that they stole. It would have been a low-stakes game though, because I doubt they would have played for keeps and had their shares adjusted based on whatever in-game money each player had at the end of the game. But while these idiots were having fun playing board games, what was going on with the train? Surely that sort of thing can't go unnoticed for too long. Well, let's leave the gang for a minute and find out. Eventually, a guard on the back of the train went to check why the engine was taking so long to get moving, and then he realised that the engine was fucking gone. So he caught a train to Cheddington, the next town over, and sounded the alarm. At 04:20 in the morning, an iconic announcement was then made on police VHF radio. A robbery has been committed, and you'll never believe it. They've stolen the train. The authorities immediately scrambled into action in one massive holy shit moment. Postmaster General Reginald Bevins returned early from holiday, inundated with questions from the press, and he mobilised the post office's investigation branch to look into every single man who was working on the train that very night. There were rumours of foul play abound as 3 men on the train had criminal records, but no gang connections, so they were cleared of suspicion. Other post office staff were also surveilled, having their purchases tracked and their genealogy traced if their surnames happened to be similar to any of the robbers. The investigators also took stock of what they'd lost. 636 high-value packages in 120 sacks, totalling at £2,595,997 and 10 shillings. Additionally, crack units from Scotland Yard and Buckinghamshire Police took on the case, led by Detective Chief Superintendent Jack Slipper. A massive search for the gang went underway, utilising as much manpower as they could to sweep the area, focusing on the homes of known criminals and their girlfriends. What helped them a lot was the gang's last instructions to Mills, limiting their search area to half an hour's drive. The hideout was actually a bit further afield, but this tidbit was enough to spook the hell out of the gang, who were all listening into the police radio and somehow managed to hear that the police were searching in a 30-mile radius rather than a 30-minute one. What didn't help their nerves were RAF planes flying low nearby. This was actually just a completely unrelated exercise, but this made the gang panic and they actually decided to cut their plans to stay in the farm for a few days short. They split up, found whatever cars they could, and left. On standby was an associate of Fields who was paid £10,000 to clean up the house and then burn it down after the gang departed. But instead, he just took the money and ran, leaving behind a massive trove of evidence. A reward of £260,000 was offered for anyone who could provide any information about the robbery. £10,000 of this was put up by the post office, whose statement read, "The loss is likely to be very heavy and may well run into 7 figures. This is the first attack on a travelling post office in the 125 years of their history." If the public wasn't absolutely enthralled before, they sure were now. One recipient of some of this bounty was a local farmhand named John Maris, who was suspicious about the comings and goings from the farmhouse, especially since the owners had blacked out all of the windows and overpaid by £100 when they bought the place 2 months prior. Remember when property was cheap? But anyway, for reporting the gang, he was awarded £19,000. 5 days after the robbery, the police had the house, and they found everything, because still stored in the house were loads of supplies, including food and stuff for sleeping. There was also parcels and post office bags lying around everywhere, including in a pit dug behind a hedge. They even found the Monopoly board, which was absolutely covered in fingerprints. But the board and the dozens of evidence bags weren't even the dumbest oversights on display in the farmhouse. Field used his real fucking name when he bought the place. These guys pretty much just snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. And to make matters even worse, a couple of unnamed associates snitched, giving the police names to match to the prints. After that, it really wasn't too hard to then link networks together and have their men pinned down. The investigation was so thorough that the gang's chances of freedom were absolutely buried under 2,000 reports, 2,350 witness statements, 20,000 index cards, and a number of stakeouts. But while the police had their men, they didn't get much of the money back, which won't be a surprise to anyone who's ever tried to use the delay repay scheme. Not even £400,000 was ever recovered. And since the serial numbers on the banknotes weren't actually recorded, the rest of it was basically untraceable, especially after it was laundered and divided amongst the gang's family and friends. But it's fine, because in 1971, some idiot decided that counting to 12 is way too hard and brought in decimalization, which made most of the stolen cash completely worthless. A lot of fuckery with money seems to have happened in 1971. How about that? As the gang was hunted down, the media did its thing and cast them in the mould of Robin Hood, since they carried no firearms and only left one living casualty. Obviously, this is far from reality as the characters involved are concerned, but journalists do still think that I radicalised a dog. There's no winning with them. But Justice Edmund Davies saw through their astroturfed anti-hero bullshit and advised the jury, let us clear out of the way any romantic notions of daredevilry. This is nothing less than a sordid crime of violence inspired by vast greed. While the hunt for some of the robbers continued for years, the massive public interest in them did have one benefit. It meant that the heat just never died down. So it was only inevitable that almost all of them were rounded up, especially since the authorities were so determined to get them. Over the rest of the year, most of the rapscallions were gradually drip-fed into prison. Of the main 15, they got 12. However, John Thomas Daly was actually acquitted after he successfully argued that his prints were only on the Monopoly board because he'd actually played a game with Reynolds earlier that year. And therefore, the presence of his prints on the board proved nothing by themselves. That was clever, I'll give him that. Despite the police's best efforts, 3 robbers were ultimately never caught. And lots of names have been thrown around over the years as people tried to figure out who they might be. Officially, they were referred to as 1, 2, and 3. Number 1 was probably a man named Harry Smith, who avoided justice through the fastidious use of aliases. The man was such a professional that even fellow gang members claimed to not know his real name. To them, he was just Bill Jennings or Flossie. Number 2 was certainly Danny Pembroke, alias Frank Monroe. In 2009, he passed away, so his son told the whole story. Reportedly, Pembroke's prints and DNA were absent from the farm because he refused to eat or use the bathroom there, and he constantly wore gloves. He was just very, very careful. After the show was over, he laid down in America for a few years before settling down in Kent. And number 3 is reported by the Sun newspaper to be a boxer named Billy Ambrose, on the grounds that his face resembles an identikit image generated after being spotted near Leatherslade Farm. Incidentally, I think the Sun's expose came across as rather smug, which is to be expected because the Sun are pricks. It's a shame that a fifth of the robbers got away with it, but on the bright side, there were some minor associates who took their places behind bars. Bilbo was arrested with £141,000 in his possession, and he was sentenced to 24 years in prison for receiving stolen goods. While inexplicably having that much money is suspicious, and Bo probably didn't even know about the heist, Reynolds claimed that he actually wasn't involved in any way at all and had done nothing wrong. In 1970, he died of cancer while still in prison. I'm not gonna lie, that's pretty fucking awful if Reynolds was actually telling the truth, but even if he wasn't, that's still some spectacularly bad luck. Another guy in the wrong place at the wrong time was a solicitor named John Wheater, who got 3 years for conspiring to pervert the course of justice because he didn't go straight to the police after the robbery. Why, you ask? Well, when he helped Field buy Leatherslade Farm, he had no idea of what it was for until it was too late. That's a bit of a bummer. There was also a gangster named Billy Hill who was a suspect for a while. He knew about the heist, but he wasn't actually involved, which seemed to really annoy him because he is quoted as saying, "I am fucking mad about all this publicity without the money to go with it." But what about the main eventers? How did the key players get their just desserts? Well, it wasn't a promising start because Goody was released after questioning due to a lack of evidence. For a while. But on the 10th of October 1963, after a load of the gang had already been busted, there was enough in him to charge him for conspiracy to rob and armed robbery, which earned him 30 years in prison. But he was released in 1975. The gang was handed a total of 307 years in prison, with most sentences set at 25 to 30 years each. According to Justice Davies, this was because, and I quote, "to deal with this case leniently would be a positively evil thing." However, few of the robbers stayed inside for more than a baker's dozen years. Practically all of the sentences were lowered on appeal, or the robbers were just released early. After serving their time, a few of them emigrated to Spain, but almost none of them actually got to enjoy their fortunes for very long. Either the police took whatever they were caught with, or they got completely screwed out of their cuts after trusting friends to look after it for them. You know what they say about honour among thieves. Buster Edwards fled to Mexico, ran out of money, and then turned himself in 1966. After 9 years, he was released and he spent the rest of his life selling flowers outside of Waterloo Station, and pining for the glory days. He reflected, "I know I'm lucky to have got a chance to have this stall and be my own boss, but it's so dreary compared with the life I used to lead. It wasn't even the money. I've been on jobs that haven't netted me a penny. But oh, does the adrenaline flow." Despite being a seasoned criminal, Edwards came to an end that makes me genuinely feel for him. He fell deeply into depression and a vodka bottle a day drinking problem that culminated in him hanging himself in 1994, with enough booze in his system to kill a normal man. His funeral was attended by a couple of his partners in crime, as well as Charlie Cray. Say what you will about the great train robbers, it's honestly rather wholesome that some of them attended each other's funerals over the years. Cordray was about as unlucky as Goody, having managed to successfully avoid the law until he just so happened to rent a lockup from a police officer's widow. He got 20 years, which was reduced to 14 after he cooperated with the police. He then went back to floristing in the West Country, but I doubt he helped with Edward's business. Wilson only served 4 months of his 30 years before escaping from prison, because these guys just can't sit still. 4 years later, he was recaptured in Canada and spent another decade inside prison before emigrating to Spain. And in 1990, he was actually murdered in, and I shit you not, I'm being completely serious, a cycle-buy shooting. Ronnie Biggsy's adventures after the robbery made him the most famous of them all. He was arrested within the month of the heist, taunting the police with, "Get on with it, you have to prove it all the way, I'm admitting nothing to you people." Well, they did prove it and he was sentenced to 30 years. But in 1965, he made a rope ladder and escaped prison in a furniture van. He then fled to Paris, got plastic surgery, and then moved to Australia and then Brazil. In 1969, Biggs was arrested in Rio, but he avoided extradition because he had a child who was born there. Fucking anchor babies. In 1978, he recorded a song with the Sex Pistols titled No One Is Innocent. And he was then also captured by British soldiers and taken to Barbados with the intent of being brought back to justice. However, no extradition treaty even existed, so the plan just fell apart and they had to release Biggs and he just went back to Brazil. Eventually, however, Biggs came home in 2001 after a series of strokes, and he was promptly arrested. In 2009, he was released on compassionate grounds and died on the 18th of December 2013. Bruce Reynolds was the last of the gang to be arrested, having avoided the police until 1968 by laying low in Mexico and Canada, then settling in Torquay under the alias Keith Hiller. He lost what remained of his ill-gotten gains, got captured, got 25 years, but was out in 10. In the 80s, he was jailed again for 3 years for selling amphetamines, which was something that a number of fellow gang members fell afoul of. Reynolds struggled to find work after his second stint in prison, and lamented that he, and I quote, became an old crook living on handouts from other old crooks. He died on the 28th of February 2013. Bobby Welch got 30 years and was released in 1976. He then lived a rather quiet life working as a car dealer until he lost a leg to a botched operation. While his run-in with the law was no different from most of his comrades, he was notable for being the last surviving member of the Great Train Robbers, until he died in November of 2023. Escapes, crimes and retirements aside, the most notable and amusing thing that the Great Train Robbers did after leaving prison was having the brass neck to make a book deal. Naturally, the rumour mill started going crazy all over again as interest was drummed up by ridiculous rumours that the Ulsterman didn't even exist and that the whole thing was actually plotted by a reclusive mastermind, and that it was actually the work of Nazis. Some say that the Great Train Robbery was actually funded by Otto Skorzeny, who later laundered some of the money. Of course, we know that this is all bullshit, not just because of how absurd that is, but because Edwards himself has actually admitted to funding the entire thing, at a cost of £38 per robber. In 1995, Reynolds published his own autobiography of a thief, in which he reflected that we may have been villains, but we were gentlemen villains. The gang seem to have either believed or played up to the media's Robin Hood narrative because Wisby is quoted as saying, "The only regret I have got is getting caught. I wanted to go on." At least he's honest. And he also deserves credit for having enough integrity to get put away after refusing to bribe a policeman £30,000 to get rid of evidence. He also appeared in the Your Smile music video dressed as a train guard, and he was a consultant on the 1988 film adaptation of The Robbery titled Buster, in which the titular character is played by Phil Collins. Another part of the gang's cultural footprint, which I do find rather amusing, is actually a 1979 Mini Cooper advert, which claimed, "Nips in and out like Ronnie Biggs." They even put a poster near Edwards' flower stall, but because no one apparently has a sense of fucking humour, this little joke attracted a load of complaints to the Advertising Standards Authority. But the only thing that they cared about was whether or not British Leyland had permission to use Biggsy's name. To be fair, the robbers weren't the only ones looking to make a quick buck out of their infamy. The owner of Leatherslade Farm actually turned the house into an attraction, charging £0.50 for adults and letting the kids in for £1. Yeah, the old owner actually got the farm back. An associate of the gang named Leonard Field, no relation, actually convinced the owner to let them move in 2 weeks before money changed hands. Obviously, they never got around to doing that, so the sale just never went through. And I expect that the owner made a fair chunk of change because the public interest in the Great Train Robbery was absolutely massive back in the day. Such a thing had never happened at this scale before, and many erroneously believed that this was actually the first ever postal train robbery. Which it absolutely wasn't. Especially not in America. I mean, back in the Wild West, that shit happened all the fucking time. The legacy of the Great Train Robbery isn't all fun and games though, as the engineers who got held up didn't have a great time of it over the subsequent years. Mills went back to work in May of 1964, but he never fully recovered from his injury. And he suffered from regular headaches until he died of leukemia in 1970. Whitby was traumatised and sadly died of a heart attack at the age of 34. But for their courage in such a terrible experience, they were commemorated with a plaque in Crewe Station. For years after the robbery, Bridego Bridge was known as Train Robbers Bridge, which was considered insensitive in 2013, leading to a pressure campaign to change it. The editorial section of the Railway magazine wanted it named after one of the engineers, which I think would have been more fitting and deserved enough. But the name that won out was ultimately Mentmore Bridge. Personally, I don't see what was wrong with Bridego Bridge in the first place, but look, it doesn't matter what you call it. The locals in the area decide what it's called, and all the locals in the area call it Train Robbers Bridge. While the Great Train Robbery is a rare case of the police actually doing their jobs effectively, their response was actually lacking in a lot of ways that contributed to reform. You see, policing used to be very local and therefore decentralised, which makes investigations surprisingly difficult when they cover a very wide area. Especially when England is so parochial that a few miles can change the entire accent and the name of bread rolls half a dozen times. You know how American cops love to bitch and squabble about jurisdictions until they bond over their mutual hatred of the fucking feds who are always sticking their noses in? It's a little bit like that. It is a bit of a mess. And this investigation was so widespread that it exposed the need for the police to operate on a greater level than just their local areas, which led to criticism on the grounds that this confusion may have allowed some of the robbers to escape. Some journalists suggested that mail trains get armed guards, but the Postmaster General dismissed this out of hand, saying that the last thing we want is shooting matches on British railways. I mean, he has a point, but also, that's gay. Also, we don't have shooting matches on our trains, we have stabbing matches. Welcome to modern Britain. But anyway, the Great Train Robbery may have actually helped usher in the creation of the regional crime squads. And this centralisation continued until today, where instead of being tons of different police officers reporting to different people all over the place, now there are no police officers fucking anywhere. Finally, we conclude with the biggest mystery of the Great Train Robbery. Who was the Ulster Man? His name remained a mystery for a long time, but in 2014, Goody finally spilled the beans because he was, quote, sick of hearing preposterous things about the crime. Also, he thought the Ulster Man was probably dead. So fuck it. The Ulster Man was Belfast-born Patrick McKenna. Or was he? Because you see, the verdict on that isn't very conclusive, because he was far from wealthy, even for a crook who was sensible with his takings, and the position that he actually had in the post office would not have furnished him with the knowledge of this particular train, or even the railways at all for that matter. In 2019, the Telegraph came to the conclusion that the Ulster Man was actually criminal fixer Sam Osterman. And they also concluded that his role in setting the heist in motion was much less significant than widely believed. How much less significant though? Did he actually exist? We've no fucking idea. But in 2023, the Sun newspaper decided to also have a crack at it. Their man was Gerald McMorrin, who was a much better fit for the profile than McKenna, because he occupied a higher position in the post office and he also worked in the security unit. And therefore, he would have known the exact details of the train's schedule and its payload. However, his daughter denied that her father could have or would have done such a thing. To be fair, the only evidence against him is circumstantial, and I'm inclined to believe him innocent until properly proven guilty. And hey, it's just a theory, and considering the Sun's newspaper's track record with libel and smears, even against me, I wouldn't bother to read too much into their conclusions. Besides, does it really even matter at this point? McMorrin died in 1999. So it's not as if the reveal of his identity would make much of a difference. Everyone involved in the entire affair is dead. So, as far as I'm concerned, the case is as good as closed, and we might as well just let it rest. But every single good story needs at least a few hanging threads to keep people talking. And as far as threads go, you can't go wrong with a shadowy mastermind directing a rogues gallery of ruffians from the inside. I just thought I would look into it because I love a good caper. And the identity of the Ulsterman remaining a bit of a mystery only makes the story that little bit more compelling. Also, I love trains.
It's Count Dankula on YouTube! Everybody just subscribe!